My name is Adrique Vernieuwhuis, and on behalf of the festival, welcome. I'm very pleased that we have this industry talk today. As I mentioned before to other people, while I was in university, I was studying documentary and reading books of Bill Nichols. So I'm so proud that we have him here today and that you will hear his talk today. This session will be moderated by Neil Young from The Hollywood Reporter, and I would like to hand over to him now, and please give him a warm round of applause.
As you may know, this is the seventh and the last of this year's industry talks here at IDFA, and this one is going to be, I think, the most general and wide-ranging of the industry talks, but we'll also try to tie it in with what's happening at this festival and what's happening in the world of documentary in general. But none of you have come to listen to me talk, so I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. What you've come for is to hear our star guest today, our very special guest, who's just overcoming his jet lag because he's come all the way from America. So please give a big Amsterdam welcome to Bill Nichols.
There's so many things one could talk about in terms of trends, and I'm not going to talk about some of the most obvious, maybe because they are, but so the whole digital, cell phone, online, internet, blah, blah, blah. All of that is clearly out there, and I don't have a lot to say about that because it's out there, but I wanted to put it in a context of looking at some other things that are maybe more related to what's actually done in films now, and how that fits with the history of documentary. So I was going to suggest there are several turning points. The 30s, with the rise of sound and the use of sound in documentary, different from fiction, Hollywood, in terms of not so much character dialogue as voiceover, voice of God, sometimes poetic, sometimes boring, but there. Then the 60s with the new technologies, which allowed to move from voice of God and exposition and talking about to talking with and listening to real people, with observing, observational, cinema verite, direct cinema. I call it interactive and observational. But those styles that emerged at that time, Leacock, Pennebaker, Weissman, Maisels, all those folks, Roosh. Then I would say next, the 80s, and what I think of with Michael Moore, Werner Herzog, always, and Errol Morris, who we'll look at an example from in a second, I think is the beginning of the end of the classic documentary and the beginning of the modern documentary and its rise as a theatrical form, a engaging form, an entertaining form, a moving form, one that's had the kind of vitality that makes festivals like this possible. And maybe, in the OOs, the turn of the new century, there is also the digital and everything that implies. And I'll come at that largely from the position of social impact documentary and what that word, at least in the United States, means and some of the implications for funding and making that social impact metrics and other things have led to.
You have lined up some clips for us from various films, and the first ones are from The Thin Blue Line. And this ties into something that you've just been saying about the turning points, because it's interesting that all of those turning points that you talk about are essentially driven by technology, the advent of sound, access to technology in the more recent times. The 80s is maybe the one that isn't so technologically reliant. That's the one where it was because different voices came in, not because some machine allowed them to do that. Was it because of festivals, or what was it because of people like, producers who were giving more of a chance?
I really don't know what the answer to that is, but it definitely happened. And I think Thin Blue Line is a great example of it, so that's why we'll look at some clips from it. But one way to think of it is, there's that old Grierson definition of documentary as a creative treatment of reality. And they are always in balance, but I think from the beginning up to the 80s, the emphasis was on reality. And there was a mixed feeling about how creative can we be and still be a documentarian, that the observational mode pushed furthest in terms of a strict discipline. Don't interview, don't add music, don't meddle around, don't add sound effects, no animation, lots of no's to make it pure. And I think less accessible in the way we find, let's say, Thin Blue Line. So I think of Thin Blue Line as one of those films that reintroduced documentary to narrative and everything storytelling can bring to the documentary without becoming purely a fiction. And I think that use of narrative is one of the things that's really, like rhetoric, crucial to making a documentary work as something other than a document. Documents are factual, informational. We read the Magna Carta because it's a document. But a documentary would give us an angle on it, a perspective. There would be a voice talking about it. We would get a particular way of seeing and understanding what that document or that experience or that event meant. And I think that's what Thin Blue Line does so brilliantly. So yeah, I thought there were, I think I have 7 different things that the Thin Blue Line, I wouldn't, it's not causal, it's not the only film, but I take it as a prototype, an example of tendencies that have now become almost second nature, and we don't think, so much about them as, is that really documentary? When you add animation, special effects, that would be one. Let me see what my list has here. Music that is not simply from the scene itself or in a classic Hollywood kind of Mickey Mouse kind of supportive symphonic role. Philip Glass plays a very different kind of music. A stress on emotional affect, which is again part of the narrative storytelling that Thin Blue Line does so well. Reenactments, which were traditionally a way of recounting imaginatively what happened when the camera was not there. And with Thin Blue Line, we see reenactments as a kind of subjective fantasy or an acting out of ideology, I could argue also. We have feature fiction production values. Morris, unlike almost all filmmakers at that point in documentary, worked in 35mm. There's a credit for a production designer. The lighting and the cinematography are of Hollywood standard, which is not necessarily a virtue, but I think it in this case is. It opened up a whole new can of worms of, my God, we can make a documentary that actually looks and sounds great. Characters are complex. There's a sense of depth and intrigue to who is this person and why are they telling me what they're telling me, versus I'm a voice of God, believe what I say. And that one, I think, leads to the question that characterizes Morris's films, particularly more than necessarily all recent ones, but questions of trust, credibility, reliability, deception, self-deception, which I think is very big, and then the unreliable narrator, who's telling the truth. So if we look at a clip or two, maybe you see how the things I just mentioned play out in the film a little bit. The first clip, I hope, will be of Randall Adams, one of the 2 main protagonists who's in jail for murder and scheduled to be executed, describing how he was first interrogated after being arrested for allegedly killing a police officer. And that intercutting between Randall Adams speaking to the camera and then images that go to reenact the very thing he's describing, for which the film is most famous for the murder, where there's several reenactments of the murder of the policeman, in which we never see who actually kills the policeman, but we get versions that correspond to what different characters claim happened. So the reenactments don't authenticate the truth about historical events. They rather substantiate the subjectiveness of our memory and our stories that we tell about reality. It's not a film that says, here's a man wrongly jailed, wrongly sentenced to death, we have to save him. It lets you come to that conclusion by watching events unfold. And I think that's a really crucial point, because it's not sending a message, not waving a flag. It's saying, here's a way of seeing this particular reality. What do you make of it? And Morris himself has said he did not intend this as a Rashomon in the sense of who knows. He intended it in the sense of everyone has a different perspective, but some are truer than others. And there is a murderer and there is an innocent man, and we can actually tell the difference. But it's not as easy as it seems.
And then later in films like Capturing the Freedmans of Jarecki, which is again, you think you're watching one film, the film gradually morphs, and you suddenly realise that the carpet has been taken out from under your feet. And at the end of it, I mean, I don't know how you could watch Capturing the Freedmans and not think, this is a terrible thing which has happened here.
Yes, I think particularly the son, Jesse, but it's a very unraveling kind of film where it appears to be one thing, then suddenly it's another thing, and then, maybe it's not quite as clear-cut as either of those things. So it's, I think it follows in the footsteps, as many films have, yes.
And of course for Morris, at the end of the film, as you say, the audience is left. Now, I think a lot of documentaries, you watch them thinking it's that kind of film, and in the last 5 minutes suddenly you realise, and then the website comes up and you can make a difference and you can go to this Facebook page and it's,
yes.
But by the time you've done that, it might be a year later and the whole, the trial might be going on. I mean, there's that one with the Robin Hood Hills Paradise Lost films,
Paradise, yes.
which followed this case over sort of many years,
Yeah,
and it's not a sort of specific thing to say, come and join us. It's sort of saying, now go off and find your own truth, your own perspective.
And those films, to me, are particularly the original, the first, are really fascinating. And the Reese Witherspoon dramatic fiction of the same events is, I'd say, kind of boring by comparison, like Rescue Dawn compared to Little Peter Who Loves to Fly and needs to learn to fly, something like
Needs to fly.
Needs to fly. Yes. Werner Herzog's documentary, the other remade as a fiction with Christian Bale, which I think doesn't work as well as a fiction. But
in a film which if you say Rescue Dawn to people, it seems to have sort of faded away.
Yes.
Whereas Little Dieter is still seen as a major
people remember the title.
And the second clip that you have
Yes.
from the Thin Red Line Thin Blue Line. The Thin is a slightly shorter clip. What was
Yes.
it about this clip that you?
I just wanted to underline some of the qualities in the first clip of the pen dropping on the table, the gun flopping on the table, with one of the reenactment scenes. To me, it's the glop that went around the world. We don't have to be just realistic. There's a subjective quality to reality in how people see and perceive it, and we can represent that as part of the documentary tradition. So this malt, has no real relation to anyone's claims about the truth of who killed whom, and it doesn't matter one whit.
We've talked a lot about American documentary trends and the influence of the Thin Blue Line and Paradise Lost and Capturing the Freedmans. From your perspective, to what extent did those influences ripple around the world? Australian documentaries and documentaries from non-English language speaking countries. There's a slew of documentaries from Latin and South America, which are again dealing with injustice and specific trials and cases. For you, Morris was essentially an international impact. It wasn't. Primarily felt within the USA, but certainly within Europe and wider afield.
Yeah. Documentary is a form that has very strong national histories because issues and events are local. But it also has an international dimension, as we see from the early Ziga Vertov in the Soviet example, the Grierson example, the Canadian films, many of the American observational, Rouche in France, Joris Evans here. They circle the globe in their influence, and when you were mentioning that, I was thinking of Isle of Flowers as a Jorge Furtado's film, which is animated and very surreal, about a garbage dump and its ecology, how things get there and how people are allowed to scavenge in the dump after the pigs come in to feed first. You know, but it's not so bald as I just put it. And I think there are films from just about every country. I was thinking also of Mark Lewis's Cane Toads, which can't remember the date of, but Cane Toads has a very surreal and humorous element, which was not always part of the documentary tradition, which is typically sober-minded, serious, straightforward. And Lewis makes a film about the invasion of the cane toad into Australia, which he's redone. I don't know if it played here, but a 3D version also more recently, which made it even clearer that the panic about the cane toad, which had an environmental basis because it was eating important crops, but it also was an allegory for immigration. And it's very clear in the newer version of cane toads that this is part of a knee-jerk kind of reflex of what do we do when alien types into our space. In this film, part of Morris's argument, if you take the ideology part I mentioned, is that the police have an ideology about guilt, and non-Texans are more likely to be guilty of killing an officer than a local boy who they've already heard of because he's had run-ins and has had trouble, but he's sort of like your typical juvenile delinquent, and they don't think of him as a killer. And I think at the time of the event, David Harris, the other protagonist, was 16 or so. He's just quite young. And that's now morphed into, not just assuming that this outsider guy is the killer, and that the police have a kind of instinct for who's good and bad, into Ferguson, where that idea of right and wrong, good and bad types, racial types, has morphed into something really quite nightmarish. Yeah.
Of course, The Thin Blue Line was made, its post-production process, it eventually gets to cinemas in Britain and Australia and Japan and all that kind of thing. And years then pass. But getting back to Earl Morris, I remember at the time there was a sort of disappointment that Morris then did a fiction film, The Dark Wind,
Yes.
which was a kind of disaster and a flop. I mean, this is kind of getting off the subject slightly, but do you think if that had been a hit, he would have just gone off and done fiction films? Because at the time it was like, oh no, documentary can be as good or better than fiction. And this is our poster boy. It's like when Nick Hornby wrote Fever Pitch, and then he announced his next book was going to be a novel, and everybody went, no. But the whole point of Nick Hornby was that non-fiction was going to be at this level. So do you remember that period of The Dark Wind and everybody putting their head in their hands slightly?
Yes, and then their hands over their eyes. But yes, and I can only say thank goodness it was a flop in a certain sense, because I don't love and don't always admire everything he's made since, but I think he's really like Herzog, and more recently, but in the same spirit as they helped produce it, Joshua Oppenheimer's talk, The Act of Killing. These are films that really do set a very high bar for other people and are inspiring. Yeah.
And you mentioned Act of Killing there, and also The Thin Blue Line, where we see participants talking about what they did and why they did it and all this kind of thing. And this brings us to what we're talking about now, which is the current trends. And the first one that you've identified is performance, because people can perform in documentaries and always have done. But now this idea of performance is being directly addressed. Yesterday I saw Robert Greene's Actress, which I'm sure many of you have seen. So what was it about performance that was the first thing of the current trends that stood out for you? Is that the most interesting one for you?
Not necessarily most interesting, but definitely it's just as you put it. I think we've always known people. There was a book by Irving Goffman back in the 60s called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, where he talked about how we are, in some sense, theatrically presenting ourselves to others, and there's always a sort of backstage us that isn't visible in a given scene, but in another scene with different people, that part of us may emerge, and so on. But most documentaries, I think, more or less were concerned with not too much more than, do I have a character who is cinematic, in terms of having a presence which is a chemistry kind of question, but a presence on film. And to what degree does camera awareness affect or not affect their performance? And that was a big debate in the 60s in particular. And I think it's gotten more nuanced. That's why I mentioned it as a trend. I think there are a lot of films that are looking at how can we represent people representing themselves? What are the options that are available? And how much license or room, space can you give people to present themselves rather than observe them and record them as they go about their business in front of the camera? What if you collaborate in some way with them about how do you want to be presented?
Is it even possible now for a filmmaker to try to even say, this is the truth, this is the world? Can anybody say that?
Yeah, I think what you see is that the varnish is a little uneven, and if you put it on yourself, that there's a varnishing that is self-applied, that was even more vivid in the act of killing.
The sheep in Sweetgrass don't know they're being filmed. So the performances there by the sheep are
unvarnished. Probably unvarnished, yeah. There's, I'm going to show a clip from Sweetgrass, and the only thing that might be varnish, as it were, is that they pass in front of the camera, they don't run into the camera, but they know to keep their stage distance.
Yeah. You mentioned active killing there, which I know is going to be the next couple of clips, which is, I mean, you know, I can't think of a documentary in my lifetime, that certainly since The Thin Blue Line, that had the level of impact that the active killing has had. It played in a London cinema for an entire year, which was, you know, well, it was only once a week, but at least it was there for the entire year. And yet it was rejected by, I mean, famously the commissioning editor of the BBC refused to show the film because he didn't think, well, he thought it was a terrible film, which is entirely his, you know, he's entitled to do that.
It was morally wrong to allow killers to have a voice.
Yeah, so that degree of polarization, which I still get, because, you know, I think it's a masterpiece, but I speak to people who would say it's one of the most reprehensible and horrible things they've ever seen. So in terms of performance, what was it specifically about the act of killing that ties in with the trend?
Yeah, well, it's probably not a coincidence that Morris and Herzog are executive producers of Act of Killing. And I think it's partly the surrealism that Morris has in Thin Blue Line. It's the reenactment as both fantasy and ideology. It's, you know, how do I represent the past in a way that is subjectively true to how I want to remember it, and how I want others to remember it for me. Because the film, as Neil was suggesting, is, you know, a film about men who were the leaders of death squads in Indonesia, killing alleged communists who happened to mostly be Chinese in the 60s, and now, decades later, are still treated as heroes. There's been no justice if murder is supposed to lead to some kind of justice, because it was sanctioned. This is what the government wanted. The film the other day, those who said no about the Iranian political dissidents in 1988, who the Ayatollah Khomeini had murdered because they did not support his regime secretly at the time, is in the same spirit as what happened in Indonesia. So Oppenheimer, you know, there's a lot of backstory. I'll try to skip that to get to the point that he worked with these men who were killers, Anwar Congo most notably, and two others, to tell what happened in their own words. So I see this as part of another trend, which I'm not exploring in detail, but there's actually a really good book on it by Raya Morag of perpetrator cinema, films that are about the perpetrators rather than the victims. His new film is The Other Side of the, what's it called again?
Look of Silence.
Look of Silence. The Look of Silence, the act of killing. And the title, I think, is definitely meant to be more, you know, multiple meanings, but the act as a performance of killing, because in the reenactments, which is what we'll see structured, the reenactments are clearly designed to present that as a performance performance piece almost, based on apparently how the killers thought murder should occur from what they saw in westerns and gangster films, Hollywood Returns. To me, the main point of this clip is to show that performance by the victim, is wrenching. It may be play acting, but it's so close to the truth that he can barely manage to contain himself, and it's very hard to act in some willful way body fluids, to cry and have snot coming out of your nose and saliva dribbling from your mouth by just choice. I think this is method acting of a kind that is very, very visceral, and that's part of the depth, I think, that Oppenheimer gets at, ironically, because these guys have no clue that they're being cruel all over again. Yes, John?
When Shade talks about the communalization of trauma, that would depend on this film being seen in Indonesia and being as big a deal there as it is in other countries, which is a tricky situation because the government is still, it's the same party still in charge.
Yeah, the moral entry question is one I was going to bring up with of Men in War, but it as I understand it, it's certainly relevant. It involves the way in which people who have done something that violates their innermost beliefs, which could typically be murder. You kill someone, but under some form of duress, so it often comes up in the military, which is what Men in War is about. And there's some form of remorse. And it's a kind of trauma that has to do with violations of one's own morality. I think that's part of what the act of killing puts into question, particularly with Anwar, is to what degree is he remorseful? If you've seen the whole film, that's a kind of motif running through it. We could have different answers and debates about that. But the moral entry is a way of thinking about trauma that is specifically geared to culpable perpetrators who have some feelings of remorse that is based on a violation of basic fundamental principles. And then how do you work that through ritual and communal acceptance of the perpetrator in some way, which is far from complete in Indonesia.
So you've identified what you call experiential, effective filmmaking, and this brings in Men in War and also Sweetgrass,
yes,
which we were talking about. Now this, to me, is documentary moving in an entirely different direction from performance-oriented ones, and it's basically, as you've written about, how it's more going back to the, let's say, documentary which has one foot in the avant-garde, which is always for me the interesting part, where avant-garde seeps into narrative or documentary, whatever it is. Because if we abandon the avant-garde, then where do we go back to? Because we're not moving forward anymore. So what is it about experiential, effective filming at the moment which caught your attention? Which are the best examples of that?
Yeah, we'll look at a couple of the examples, and to me, this gets to the heart of what I think is one of the key qualities of documentary, which is what does it feel like to inhabit the world in a particular way? Now that's a different question from, is global warming real? Or what are the consequences of toxic waste dumps? Those are also questions that I think are at a more empirical, factual, informational level, and we often think that's what documentary is about. They tell us things about the world informationally, we learn. And to me, that's forgetting, it's important and it's part of the tradition, but it's forgetting that we learn best when we're motivated and moved to learn, and we're moved emotionally. And so I think part of what documentaries can do, and these examples do, is to give us a sense of what does it feel like to inhabit the world in a particular way, to inhabit a body that is racked with guilt and remorse, of Men in War, for example. I'm trying to work that through in the context of moral injury. I violated my own deepest held beliefs by killing one of my fellow soldiers who was one of my best friends by accident when I left my gun loaded and shot his head off. How do you deal with that?
The idea that documentary moving beyond the cinema, and obviously in this festival there's a whole section of installations and things like this, and as you say, galleries, and in Berlin the Forum Expanded sort of takes it out, and now of course people will be able to watch documentaries, I mean as well as on television of course, but on their mobile phones. So in a way it's kind of documentary which begins in cinema, or develops from photography, we can go on from that, is kind of transcending the cinema now? Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think this work, like Agnes Varda, Chris Marker, it's work that doesn't know a boundary in that sense. It's not roping itself into a corral that is a traditional documentary corral, but using affective, expressive, experiential dimensions that are non-explanatory. We don't really know what's going on, other than the sheep are moving, in order to engage us and involve us in the aesthetic experience, I'd say. So yeah, I think that's true.
What would happen if a filmmaker just said, I want to have no music on this? Would the BBC turn around and say, sorry, take it elsewhere? And it's not just BBC, I mean there are commercial broadcasters as well.
Yeah, I think that's where the blurring of fiction documentary, one of the places that's very vivid is with music and the use of music. It's perfectly okay now, back in the 60s with observational. To add music to a scene of any kind would be a violation, among certain people, Leacock, Pennybaker, and so on. And now, like you say, I think it's de rigueur almost that you must have some kind of music to keep the audience interested. And if you're not clever and innovative and thoughtful about that process, you wind up with the escalator, elevator kind of airport music that is like classic Hollywood B movies. It's just there to amplify the emotional intent and signal it to the audience rather than give the audience something to work with.
The last trend you've identified is reactionary content.
Yeah.
Now, these reactionary films love music, and the more right-wing a film is, the more music it has. Is that a good barometer?
Well, we'll see if that's true for this clip. This will be an interesting litmus, because I think Dinesh D'Souza, the man that made this, who's a famous, well-known right-wing commentator, attacked universities as too left and liberal first, and then now he's moved on to Obama and other topics ever since. I think he's part of his dangerousness, as it were, is not unlike Leni Riefenstahl's in that, whether she was a Nazi or not is irrelevant, but that he's clever and he knows what he's doing, even though it's his first film, as far as made with another man, so there, he may have more experience in it. But I wanted to show this as a trend, just as a kind of don't forget. Because the festival, almost all documentary festivals, almost all writing on documentary, almost everyone interested in this room who's making documentary or studying it, has some version of progressive politics, I would guess. I'm assuming, so I apologize if I'm assuming wrongly for some people, but it's part of the tradition, going back to the Soviet and British examples, and ever since, it's progressive, ameliorative, looking for social impact that does good, makes change happen, etc. But documentary is not, in and of itself, politically baptized to be progressive. It's a form of cinema that uses all the tools and resources of film for whatever ends the filmmaker chooses. And there is a right-wing political documentary, I'm not sure I should say movement, but certainly element that has been there all along. They usually are not films that get here or other festivals. They often circulate, as many social impact advocates now speak of, through stakeholders, words like that are used, but vested interest groups. Films about fundamental religion are shown in fundamentalist churches to that community. And we may never hear of them, and hundreds of thousands of people may have seen them. Dinesh begins with puzzles about why does Obama do what he does? Why does he give a bust back of Winston Churchill back to the British? Why does he help the Brazilians drill for oil? Why doesn't he do more to help the rebels in Syria? Why does he do this? Why does he do that? And the answer comes from the fact that he had communist trainers, I guess you could say, and went to study oppression studies, as Dinesh calls it, oppression studies when he was in school in Hawaii. So this all results in somehow Obama also being a secret Muslim and having what we will see next as his ultimate goal.
I think we've got one clip left to play, which was from Citizen 4, and this is tying in again with social impact. What direct influence can documentaries have, not just in terms of other documentaries, which is a marvelous thing, but essentially a narrow thing, but in terms of changing the debate. And to me, this is where documentary and journalism come hand in hand. Because 50 years ago, you'd have read Time magazine and Newsweek, and now nobody reads magazines, and nobody bothers reading the New York Times Sunday supplement. But they might watch a half-hour film or a TV program. So did you select this because this has replaced traditional journalism as a way? So Laura Poitras's film Citizen 4 is kind of dealing with these behind the headlines issues now.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of how something from the 60s, the observational style, has morphed also into something that can present a very intimate portrait of someone who is a banner headline on the other hand, and give us an affective, emotional, complex, almost literally behind the scenes look at someone who we get a much simplified, stereotyped picture from the government and much of the media. And I was just going to show the trailer in case you haven't seen it.
This is the film about Edward Snowden, of course.
Yes, about Edward Snowden and the NSA's massive surveillance programs.
There are so many stories to present. And now it's Ebola, now it's this, now it's there's an earthquake here, now it's that. And we forget that 6 months ago it was Boko Haram was the big story, and nobody ever talks about Boko Haram. And so you have 5 minutes to make people interested in Edward Snowden, and you can only do that by making him a kind of essentially a two-dimensional figure. So being optimistic, the fact that people like Laura Poitras still use documentary cinema as a way of dealing with this story, because there are 1,000 different ways of telling it. You could do a ballet about it. You could make a sculpture on him. You could do a video game based on Edward Snowden. I don't know what you could do, but the fact that she thinks the documentary can still do that. Does that give you optimism as well for the future of documentary?
I think in some ways it's more classical in that, unlike say Morris with his preoccupation with self-deception, she's giving us a sense of a performance, how Edward Snowden presents himself as one that has some genuine sincerity, authenticity, honesty, decency, and that those words, which can be bandied, actually have some meaning. That there are people who are honest and decent and respectful and thoughtful, and this man is one of them. One of the reasons I had this structure to the presentation is that most of the clips and most of the films and trends I've been discussing are not exactly what would be called social impact in current terms in the US. It is a term that has arisen largely from funders, not from filmmakers. I think filmmakers have always wanted to have an impact. It's sort of taken for granted. But funders, like the Fledgling Fund and many others, have gone to some length to say, before we give you money, we want to see documentation about how you're going to achieve impact. And we want to be able to measure it. To me, that's problematic, but it's tying funding to a particular type of film that can have a measurable impact. One of the things that a lot of the current assumptions about how do you have an impact forget, or what Stuart Hall wrote about with the cultural studies some time ago, that we have resistance to change. And reading and interpreting is a very complex process. Everyone doesn't see and read and understand films or books the same way. You bring things to it and so on. And framing is the frames that are already there and assumptions that are already there. And one of the works, I think, of the great films, and this is where Laura's film would come in terms of how it does it, is to reframe the issue. You know, it's not that this guy is a traitor who did something really horrible because he's a very bad person. This is an honorable, decent person, so why would he do what he did? It changes the frame. It reframes the issue. And I think that's what The Act of Killing does. That's what a lot of, to me, great documentaries do that have an impact that has genuine ripples, because you can't get them out of your system.
You showed a number of clips of different sorts of documentaries and genres, but I came in late, but I didn't notice any observational films there. How do you see the role? You did mention reality TV, but how do you see the role of observational films in terms of having that impact that you're talking about, the ripple effect?
I've had students who, and sometimes I have this feeling myself, that some observational films feel like voyeurism. That there's a really creepy, disturbing quality to someone whose presence is not acknowledged, who's always there. A Married Couple, a Canadian film, has some of that. I think it's brilliant in some ways, but it also gives me the creeps to some degree. And I think films like Of Men and War, which is largely observational in the festival, a large element of Citizen 4, and others have propelled the observational mode into a fresher territory in some way by choosing situations like Lee Cock Pennybaker did to some degree, where there's something at stake and there's going to be an outcome, and it doesn't really matter what the outcome is dramatically, because you'll get an arc. And I think with the therapy that the veterans go through, with Snowden, coming to the point of exposure and revelation in terms of what he knows and no one else knows yet outside the government, that you have a built-in drama, and then you observe how someone comports themselves in that context. And I think in those films, the role and presence of the filmmaker is quite vivid in a way that the fly on the wall sometimes fails to do. So that I never felt in either of those examples, for example, that there was a voyeuristic intent, that, I just want to see what you do, and I'm just going to watch. There's a sense of, I'm invested in this.
Can we say like it's the same thing with the Act of Killing's characters? Like maybe how Joshua, said like, convinced them to be in the film is that, so we want to hear from you. So maybe that's also the same thing. It doesn't always have to be for the good.
Yeah. It's like Jesus Camp, that film about Becky Fisher, who's a fundamentalist missionary trying to convert young boys and girls, impressionable boys and girls, to very fundamentalist Christian beliefs. And she has a very big voice in the film. There's things that you could say are undercutting it to some degree. But you could also watch that film, and she, I would say, could watch that film and say, that's a fair representation of me. That's what I do. And I could imagine her using that film as a kind of recruiting tool. So they're taking a risk when they make that film, because I don't have any feeling whatsoever that they agree with her. Nor do I feel like Oppenheimer agrees with Anwar Congo and that they did a good thing. But yes, he's giving them the chance to tell it the way they would like to have it told.
I'm really delighted with your categories. It's quite useful, and I agree with you completely about the metrics, which are a disaster, I think, in terms of how, particularly in the US, I can't speak to other countries that are going to be funded, but what I wanted to ask you about, and I really like the way that you're drawing the comparisons of returning to certain documentary traditions. And I wondered how you would see, because, for instance, in the performance, we don't need to talk about Flaherty as using performative aspects to reach an audience's emotions, but then how would you categorize things like in the late 60s and early 70s, like David Holtzman's Diary and No Lies, which, particularly in the case of No Lies, are using, as in your example, the words of the people then rearranged and put into the mouths of actors. Does that fall into, I guess my question is, where do you see that in the trends that you're talking about? Is it a reflection? Is it part of the trends? Is it going back?
let's say No Lies. I think that's a film that has been written about a lot because it is so disturbing, in that you think it's one thing only to learn it's another. And when you learn that the woman telling about a rape she experienced to a camera person who keeps challenging her validity, the emotional truth of it, why didn't she do something, you mean you just took it? At the end of the film, you realize even though everything in it, almost there are hints, but everything in it makes you think it's a documentary, it's actually actors speaking the words of women who had in fact been raped and had given testimony, verbally, on audio tape. And then the filmmaker transcribed that and worked it like Episode of the Sea, worked it into a script that was performed, in this case by actors who perform pretty convincingly. So you get twisted and have work to do in figuring out, well, is this deceiving me? Is it dishonest to pretend it's a documentary? Or is it saving me? Is it giving me room to think about this issue without actually having to witness someone being tortured again by an insensitive male cinematographer who wants to challenge her account of rape?
Please join me in thanking our terrific guest today, Bill Nichols.